The heat was a physical weight on the town of Redemption, pressing down on the dust that coated every surface in a fine, ochre film. It settled in the lungs and clung to the back of the throat. Inside the steaming confines of Chen's laundry, the air was thick with the scent of lye soap, hot water, and something else, the faint, sharp tang of desperation. Flint stood in the doorway, his frame blocking the brutal white light of the street. He had come to settle a freight account, a simple transaction of coin for services rendered. But the man who stood before him, Mr. Chen, was not interested in coin. His eyes, small and dark in a face creased with worry, darted from Flint's dusty boots to the worn holster on his hip. Chen's hands twisted a damp cloth, wringing it as if it were the neck of his own misfortune. His 3 daughters worked behind him, their movements economical and silent amidst the billowing steam. They folded sheets with a practiced rhythm that did not betray the tension coiling in the room. The eldest, Lin, met Flint's gaze for a fraction of a second, her expression as flat and unreadable as a stone, before her attention dropped back to her work. Chen cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. "Your reputation is known, even here. A man of substance. A man with land." He gestured vaguely toward the sun-blasted emptiness beyond the town. Flint said nothing. He was a man who preferred to let silence do his talking. "I have a proposal," Chen continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A debt I cannot pay has come due. But I have assets. My daughters." He gestured with a sweep of his hand, a merchant displaying his wares. The girls did not look up, but a stillness came over them, a sudden freezing of their rhythmic work. "They are strong. Good workers. Obedient. Choose anyone you want. Take her as your wife. The debt I owe you will be cleared, and I will add a dowry." A generous 1 inch. The offer hung in the hot, wet air, obscene and glittering. It was not a proposal of marriage, it was a bill of sale. Flint's eyes moved past Chen, to the 3 women who stood as still as statues. He saw the faint tremor in the hands of the youngest, and he saw the rigid set of the shoulders on the middle daughter, Sue. And he saw, in Lin's dark eyes, a flicker of something that was not fear, but a cold, banked fire of pure hatred. It was an ember of defiance in a world of ash, and it held his attention completely. Flint let the silence stretch, feeling the weight of 4 pairs of eyes on him. Chen's were pleading and greedy. The younger sisters held a terrified, fragile hope. But Lin's gaze was a challenge, a dare. She expected him to haggle, to inspect them like livestock, to be the kind of man her father clearly was. He thought of his homestead, a quiet place carved out of rock and thistle, built for one. It was a place of peace, earned with sweat and solitude. Bringing one of these women into it would shatter that peace. Bringing the violence of Chen's desperation into his world was a fool's errand. He should have turned and walked away. He should have collected his freight payment and ridden out of Redemption, leaving the scent of lie and misery behind him. But the look in Lin's eyes held him fast. It was the look of a cornered animal, one that would chew off its own leg to escape a trap. He understood that look. He had worn it himself, once. He made a decision then, not with his head, but with some deeper, more instinctual part of him that recognized a kindred spirit in the face of impossible odds. He finally broke the silence, his voice low and calm, but carrying an authority that made Chen flinch. "I don't want one," Flint said. Chen's face fell, the hope draining from it to be replaced by a slack-jawed panic. The younger sisters seemed to shrink into themselves. Only Lin's expression remained unchanged, as if she had expected nothing less. Flint held her gaze. "I'll take them all." The words landed in the room like stones dropped into a still pond. Chen stared, his mouth opening and closing silently. And Sue looked at each other, their faces a mask of confusion. Lin's composure finally cracked. A flicker of disbelief, of shock, crossed her features before she could suppress it. "All of them?" Chen finally stammered. "But why?" "You only need one wife." "It's not a wife I'm looking for," Flint said, his voice flat. "It's a solution. You want your debt cleared and your problem solved. This is the price." He named a figure for the freight debt, then added the supposed dowry on top, then doubled it. It was an absurd sum, but it was not about money. It was about ownership of the problem. That is my offer. For all three. They come with me today. You never see them again. You never ask after them again. We are strangers from this moment forward. Chen, caught between the terror of his other debts and the shock of this bizarre proposal, saw only the escape hatch Flint was offering. He nodded, dumbly at first, then with frantic energy. Yes. Yes, of course. Agreed. Flint looked at Lin. Pack your things. Whatever you can carry. He didn't wait for an answer, turning and walking out into the blinding sun, leaving the three sisters and their father to grapple with the sudden, brutal fact of their deliverance. The ride to Flint's homestead was a silent affair, conducted under the oppressive glare of the afternoon sun. He had procured 2 extra horses, and the sisters rode with a grim determination, their few belongings tied in bundles behind them. They did not speak to him or to each other. The homestead, when they finally reached it, was not what they might have expected. It was not a sprawling ranch but a small, defensible house of stone and timber, built into the base of a low mesa. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, stark and isolated, with clear lines of sight in every direction. There was a well-built corral, a small barn, and a patch of earth that had been stubbornly cultivated into a garden. It was a place of profound solitude, a testament to one man's labor and his desire to be left alone. Inside, the house was sparse, clean, and functional. A stone hearth dominated one wall. There was a sturdy table, 2 chairs, and a small sleeping loft. It was a space designed for a single occupant, and the sudden presence of 4 people made it feel impossibly crowded. Flint felt their intrusion like a physical pressure. The loft is yours, he said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. There are blankets in that chest. The well is out back. Don't wander past the corral after dark. The instructions were blunt, practical. He offered no words of comfort, no false welcome. He had not rescued them, he had acquired them, and the terms of their new arrangement were as yet unwritten. For 3 days, a tense and fragile truce held. Ann Sue, timid and overwhelmed, moved about the house like ghosts, performing chores with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long, hard training. They cooked, they cleaned, they fetched water, their hands never idle. Flint watched them, his expression unreadable. He spent his days working outside, mending fences, tending to his horse, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was intensely aware of their presence, the soft rustle of their clothing, the low murmur of their voices when they thought he was out of earshot. Lin was the fulcrum of their small, new world. She directed her sisters with quiet commands and reassuring glances. She was the barrier between them and this strange, silent man. She watched Flint constantly, her gaze sharp and assessing. She was trying to understand his motives, to find the angle, the hidden price for their freedom. She didn't believe in charity. Men like her father and men like Flint, hard men of a hard land, always had a reason. On the 3rd evening, she found him by the corral, sharpening a tool on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. Why? She asked, her voice low but clear. He didn't stop his work. Why what? Why us? All of us. It makes no sense. He finally looked up, his eyes catching the last of the fading light. Your father was selling you, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. I was the only bidder in the room. That's not an answer, it's the only one you're getting, he replied, and returned to his work. The conversation was over. Lin stood for a long moment, watching the rigid line of his back. He was a wall, impenetrable and unmoving. But she had seen something else in his eyes when he'd looked at her. It wasn't pity. It was something harder, something she recognized, the weary resolve of a survivor. She did not trust him, not yet. But for the first time in a very long time, she realized she was no longer afraid. The fear had been replaced by a deep and unsettling curiosity. The disruption came on the 5th day. It arrived in the form of a lone rider, a man who moved with the lazy confidence of someone who has never had to hurry. He was not a drifter. His horse was too fine, his saddle too well-oiled. He stopped just beyond the perimeter of the homestead, letting his horse drink from the trough as if he owned the place. Flint emerged from the barn, his posture relaxed but his hands empty and loose at his sides. The sisters watched from the narrow window of the house, their faces pale. Lynn recognized the brand on the horse. It belonged to Mr. Lockwood, the man who held half the territory in his fist, the man to whom her father owed more than just money. "That's a fine piece of work," the rider said, nodding toward the stone house. His voice was pleasant, conversational. "Built to last," Flint didn't reply. He simply waited. "My employer, Mr. Lockwood, is a man who values his investments," the rider continued, his smile never reaching his eyes. "He had an arrangement with a merchant in town. A Mr. Chen. An arrangement that involved certain assets. Assets that have since been misplaced." He swung down from his horse, his movements fluid. He was tall and lean, and the pistol on his hip looked like a natural extension of his body. "We heard a story," he said, walking slowly toward Flint. "A strange story about a man buying up Chen's entire inventory. Lockwood doesn't like strange stories. They upset the natural order of things." "This is my property," Flint said, his voice level. "What happens on it is my business," the rider chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Everything in this valley is Mr. Lockwood's business. He considers Chen's daughters part of an outstanding balance. He sent me to collect." He took another step closer, his hand drifting casually toward his hip. "So, you can either turn the girls over now, and we can forget this unfortunate misunderstanding. Or, we can have a much more difficult conversation inside the house," and began to tremble. Sue put a protective arm around her. Lynn's heart was a cold, hard knot in her chest. She watched Flint, saw the subtle shift in his weight, the way his eyes narrowed. She had seen him as a stranger, a captor of a different sort. But now, seeing him stand between them and Lockwood's man, she saw something else entirely. He was not just a wall. He was a shield. Flint's gaze flickered past the rider, toward the distant horizon, as if calculating odds he already knew. "There's been no misunderstanding," Flint said, his voice dropping, losing its neighborly tone and taking on the sharp edge of flint striking steel. "You're on my land. I suggest you leave it." The rider's smile vanished. "That's a poor choice." He turned, without another word, and swung back onto his horse. He galloped away, leaving a plume of dust hanging in the silent, heavy air. The pleasantries were over. The first wave had been a warning. The next would be a storm. The moment the rider was a speck on the horizon, Flint moved. There was a new urgency in his actions, a grim purpose that electrified the air. "Inside," he commanded, his voice sharp. "Get away from the windows." He strode into the house, his presence suddenly filling the small space, making it feel even more like a bunker. He went to a heavy wooden chest in the corner, one they had assumed held tools or winter supplies, and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, was a rifle and several boxes of cartridges. He checked the weapon with an economy of motion that was both fascinating and terrifying to watch. He was no farmer who happened to own a gun. This was a tool he knew intimately. He looked at Lynn, his eyes hard. "That man. You knew him." It wasn't a question. Lynn nodded, her throat tight. "He works for a man named Lockwood. The one my father." She trailed off, the lie she had been holding onto suddenly tasting like ash in her mouth. The danger was no longer theoretical. It was here, on their doorstep, and his life was now tied to theirs. The deception was a luxury she could no longer afford. "My father didn't just owe him money," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The confession tumbled out, quiet and stark in the tense silence of the room. "Lockwood is buying up all the land for the new railroad spur. Forcing people out. My father was helping him. He was laundering the money through his business." Taking a cut, she reached into the small bundle of her belongings and pulled out a thin, leather-bound ledger. She held it out to him. "My father kept records. Of everything. Names, dates, amounts. Proof of how Lockwood is stealing this valley." Flint took the book, his rough fingers tracing the cover. He didn't open it. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. "This is why he sent the rider," Flint stated. "This is what Lockwood wants." Not you. This he wants both, Lynn corrected, a bitter edge to her voice. The book is the reason. We are the liability. Loose ends. My father was trying to marry me off to get me away, to hide me, before Lockwood decided to simply erase the problem. A wave of guilt washed over her. She had brought this war to his door. This quiet, solitary man had bought himself a siege because of a secret she had kept. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words feeling small and useless. I didn't know what else to do. Flint finally looked away from her, his gaze sweeping the room, lingering on her two terrified sisters huddled together. He walked to the window, peering out at the vast, empty landscape that was no longer peaceful, but menacing. He had sought solitude and found a battle. He had paid a debt and inherited a blood feud. He closed the ledger and placed it on the table with a soft thud. Bar the door, he said, his voice quiet but absolute. And put water on to boil. It's going to be a long night. The attack came with the dusk, just as the last crimson light bled from the sky, leaving the landscape in shades of grey and deep indigo. They didn't ride in with yells or bravado. They came as shadows, dismounting out of rifle range and moving forward on foot, using the rocks and sparse brush for cover. Flint had anticipated it. He stood by the main window, the heavy rifle resting on the sill, a dark, still silhouette against the faint lamplight inside. The house was a stone box, a solid anchor in the encroaching darkness. The first shot was a sharp crack that shattered the evening calm, splintering the wooden window frame inches from his head. He didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his position, his eyes scanning the gloom. Stay down, he ordered, his voice a low growl. The sisters were huddled near the hearth, the safest point in the house, away from the windows and the door. Anne was crying silently, her face buried in Sue's shoulder. Sue held her, her own face a mask of white-knuckled terror. But Lynn was not with them. She was on her knees near the front door, stuffing rags into the gaps at the bottom, her movements quick and precise. She had found a purpose in the chaos. Another shot, this one thudding into the thick timber of the door. Flint fired back, the rifle's report a deafening roar within the stone walls. A cry echoed from the darkness outside. He worked the lever of the rifle, chambering another round, his focus absolute. He was a different man now. The quiet homesteader was gone, replaced by a cold, efficient fighter. Lynn crawled over to him, keeping low. She pushed a heavy box of cartridges across the floor until it was within his reach. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw not fear, but a fierce, burning resolve. She was not a liability. She was an ally. The exchange of fire became a deadly rhythm. The crack of the attacker's pistols, the deep boom of Flint's rifle. Glass shattered as a bullet found the small pane of the other window. Wood splintered. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder. Lynn moved through the room like a field medic, checking on her sisters, speaking to them in low, calming tones, then returning to her post, watching, thinking. She pointed to the loft. The roof, she whispered urgently. They'll try the roof. Flint glanced up, then back at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't thought of it. He had been so focused on the ground assault. Her tactical awareness, born of a life spent observing and anticipating threats, was a weapon in itself. He nodded, a curt gesture of acknowledgement and respect. The trust between them was no longer a question, it was a fact, forged in the heat and noise of the fight. They were no longer a man and his 3 wards. They were a garrison, holding the line against the darkness. The lull in the fighting was more unnerving than the noise. An hour passed with no shots, only the vast, listening silence of the night pressing in on them. The moon had risen, casting long, distorted shadows across the land. Inside the small house, every creak of the timber, every gust of wind, sounded like an approaching footstep. The air was acrid with smoke. A lantern cast a flickering, golden light over the scene, illuminating the debris of the fight, shattered glass, splintered wood, the fine layer of dust kicked up by the bullets. Flint was a dark shape by the window, reloading the rifle with steady hands. Lynn noticed the dark stain spreading across his left sleeve, stark against the pale fabric of his shirt. "You're hurt," she said, her voice quiet. He glanced down, as if noticing it for the first time. "It's a graze, let me see." She didn't wait for permission. She took the lantern and moved to his side. He didn't pull away. The bullet had torn through the flesh of his forearm, a shallow but bloody wound. She gently pushed up his sleeve. His skin was hot to the touch. The sight of his blood, shed in defense of her and her sisters, landed in her chest with a physical weight. She went to the crate where she kept their few linens and tore a clean strip of cloth. She cleaned the wound with boiled water, her touch surprisingly gentle. He watched her, his face unreadable in the shifting light. The proximity was new, charged. He could smell the faint scent of soap from her hair, feel the warmth of her hands as she worked. This was an intimacy neither of them would have chosen, born of violence and necessity. "Thank you," she said, her voice so low he barely heard it. "For this?" "For everything." He looked from her face to the wound she was bandaging. "Didn't have much choice," he grunted. "You brought a war to my door." "I know." Her voice was thick with guilt. "You could have given us to them." "Yeah," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "I could have." The words hung between them, heavy with all the things he wasn't saying. That he hadn't. That he wouldn't. The bond between them solidified in that quiet moment, a silent pact made over a wound and a shared threat. He was no longer just her protector, she was no longer just his charge. They were partners in a battle they had to win together. He flexed his bandaged arm. "It'll hold." He looked back out the window. "They're not gone. They're waiting." He was right. A flicker of orange light appeared in the distance, near the barn. Then another. They were bringing fire. The second assault was an act of desperation. Not a tactical siege, but a furious attempt to burn them out. The orange glow from the barn grew, casting a hellish, dancing light against the stone walls of the house. Lockwood's men were no longer trying to be quiet. They moved in the open now, emboldened by the fire, their shapes stark silhouettes against the flames. They hurled burning torches that landed on the timber roof, sputtering and catching on the dry shingles. Smoke began to curl down from the ceiling, thin wisps that thickened with each passing second. The smell of burning pine filled the air, sharp and choking. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm them. Sue let out a small cry, which she quickly stifled. Flint didn't waste time shooting at the men. He knew he couldn't hit them all. The fire was the enemy now. "Water," he yelled, his voice cutting through the growing chaos. "Get every bucket, every pot." The four of them became a frantic, desperate machine. Flint climbed into the loft, using a bucket of precious well water to douse the patches of ceiling where the fire was eating through. The heat was intense, the smoke blinding. Below, Lynn directed her sisters, forming a chain from the water barrel to the base of the loft ladder. They worked with a single-minded focus, their fear channeled into furious action. Sue, who had been paralyzed by terror moments before, now moved with a determined haste, her face smudged with soot. And, her small frame straining, hauled pots of water, her earlier tears replaced by a grim resolve. They were no longer victims waiting for a fate to be decided. They were fighting for their lives, for their home. A flaming brand crashed through the remaining glass of the window, landing on the floorboards. Lynn didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the chest and smothered the flames, beating them down with a raw, primal force. She rose, coughing, her eyes streaming from the smoke, and saw Flint looking down at her from the loft. In his soot-streaked face, she saw a raw, fierce admiration. The roof was holding, but the smoke was becoming unbearable. They were running out of air, running out of time. "They're at the door!" Sue screamed. Heavy blows began to rain down on the barricaded entrance, the wood groaning under the assault. They were trapped between the fire above and the men outside. Flint dropped from the loft, landing lightly on his feet. He grabbed the heavy table and, with a surge of adrenaline, shoved it hard against the door, reinforcing the bar. "We're not dying in here," he said, his voice a low, ragged rasp. He looked at Lynn, a silent question in his eyes. She understood. There was only one way out. Not to run, but to attack. To break the siege by punching a hole straight through it. She gave him a single, sharp nod. The breaking point came with a roar of splintering wood. The main bar across the door cracked, the timber groaning in protest. Outside, the men yelled in triumph, thinking their victory was imminent. It was the moment Flint had been waiting for. He kicked the heavy table away. Now, he yelled to Lynn. He wrenched the broken bar free and threw the door open, not as a retreat, but as a charge. He burst out into the firelit darkness, the rifle coming up to his shoulder in one fluid motion. The sudden, unexpected counterattack caught the men at the door completely by surprise. They were bunched together, an easy target. Flint fired twice, the shots deafeningly loud in the night. 2 men went down. The others, stunned, scrambled for cover. From the doorway behind him, Lynn hurled a cast-iron skillet with all her strength, catching a third man in the side of the head. He crumpled to the ground with a grunt. It was chaos, a maelstrom of smoke, firelight, and panicked shouts. Flint moved with a lethal grace, using the corner of the house as cover, his rifle finding its targets in the flickering gloom. He wasn't just defending, he was hunting. He was reclaiming his land, one bullet at a time. The remaining attackers, their nerve broken, their numbers suddenly and violently thinned, lost their will to fight. This wasn't the easy job they had been promised. They had come to burn out a farmer and 3 helpless women, and had instead walked into a well-defended fortress commanded by a man who fought with the cold fury of a wolf protecting its den. The retreat was a panicked scramble. One man helped a wounded comrade while the others simply ran, melting back into the darkness from which they had come, leaving their fallen behind. The night fell silent again, the only sounds the crackle of the burning barn and the ragged, desperate sound of their own breathing. Flint stood over the yard, the rifle held loosely in his hand, his body a taut line of exhaustion and adrenaline. Lynn emerged from the house, her sisters close behind her. They stood in the orange glow of the fire, a small, battered unit, surrounded by the wreckage of their home. But they were alive. They had held the line. The barn was a lost cause, a towering inferno against the night sky, but the house, their stone sanctuary, was merely wounded. It still stood. Flint finally lowered the rifle. He looked at Lynn, at her soot-stained face and the fierce, unwavering light in her eyes. He had bought himself a war, and in doing so, had found the one person on earth he would want standing beside him in one. Dawn broke pale and grey, the rising sun obscured by the haze of smoke still hanging in the air. The barn was a skeleton of blackened timbers, occasionally sighing as a piece collapsed into the smouldering ruins. The ground was littered with the evidence of the fight, spent cartridges, broken torches, the dark stains of blood in the dust. The bodies of the fallen attackers lay where they had dropped, stark reminders of the night's brutality. The 4 of them moved through the aftermath in a state of weary shock. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that was both physical and emotional. Sue Annan worked methodically, clearing the debris from inside the house, their faces set and grim. The terror of the night had burned away their childishness, leaving a hard-won maturity in its place. Flint and Lynn stood together by the corral, looking out at the destruction. The silence between them was no longer tense or suspicious. It was a shared space, filled with the unspoken understanding of what they had endured together. It was the quiet of comrades after a battle. "We held it," he said, his voice rough. It was a simple statement of fact, but it carried the weight of everything they had fought for. It was not just about the house. It was about her, her sisters, their new and fragile life. "Yes," she replied, her voice just as quiet. "We did." She looked at him, at the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the dried blood on his bandaged arm. In town, he had been a stranger, a potential threat. Now, he felt more familiar to her than her own father. Trust wasn't something he had asked for, it was something he had earned, with every shot fired, with every steady command given in the heart of the chaos. He had stood his ground when he could have run. He had protected them when he could have abandoned them. "The ledger," she said suddenly. "It's safe." "Good," he nodded. "When this is done, we'll see that it gets to the right hands." A federal marshal, maybe. Someone Lockwood can't buy. He was already thinking ahead, planning the next move, the one that would end the threat for good. He was not a man who left a job half-finished. He looked back at the house, at its scorched roof and shattered windows. "It'll take time to rebuild," he said. Rebuild, not "I'll rebuild." It was a subtle shift, an inclusion. He was no longer a solitary man. His fortress had been breached, not by enemies, but by the 3 women who now stood within its walls, who had defended it as fiercely as he had. The solitude he had so carefully constructed was gone, replaced by something more complicated, more demanding, and infinitely more valuable. He turned to her, his expression softening for the first time. "You're not a stranger," he said. Not anymore. And in the quiet aftermath of the battle, under a smoke-filled sky, those few words felt like the beginning of peace.